I think we'll begin. Welcome to the 6th of the EDAS Covid Conversations. Very warm welcome to you all. Hard to believe, really, that this is now the 6th of these that we've run. The whole idea of them is to help us develop an understanding of some of the emerging issues, both short-term issues of coping with the pandemic, but also some of the longer-term structural issues that might be kicked off by the pandemic as well. So both developing understanding and trying to share ideas and approaches to policy and practice to respond to the challenges and opportunities that are thrown up. Today's subject is we're going to look at some of the physical implications for place and property. Certainly topical. I noticed that the Economist alert this morning was headlined, "Will COVID kill the office?" So it's a topical time. So just turning to the agenda for this morning, the context is going to be set by Stephen Boyle of the Fraser of Allander Institute, building on a paper that he had published by the Fraser of Allander recently. And then we have a distinguished panel of contributors with a range of different perspectives. Phil Prentice, the Scottish Towns Partnership, Emma Mackenzie from the NewRiver Real Estate Trust, Neil Rutherford, who's also joined by Diarmaid Lawlor from the Scottish Futures Trust, and Shona from the Scottish Land Commission. So that's our panel for the day. Very much to use the old footballing cliche, a game of two halves. We'll have the contributions from Stephen and the panel, and then we'll open it up to discussion for about 30 minutes or so, which I will facilitate through using. So if I could ask you, if you have a question when we get to the discussion or a point you would like to make, to either use the chat function or to use the raised hand function in the participants section of Zoom. I'm sure all of you are pretty well versed in this now. The benefit of the blue hand function, if it allows me to see easily who is waiting, and I'm doing this off an iPad this morning. That might be easier for me. But you also have the option of contributing via social media or through the chat function as well. I should have mentioned that. The chat function both gives an opportunity to pose questions, but also we've found in the past that people can exchange ideas and information between each other there, and that's great. We'll try and finish around 11 o'clock, maybe let it run over a wee bit if needed. But if you need to leave, then please feel free to leave when you can. And many thanks for participating if you do have to leave a little early before I can formally thank you at the end. Anyway, enough from me to start things. So over to you, Stephen, just to kick things off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie, and good morning to everyone who is joining us today. I'd like to advance 3 propositions this morning. First of all, that we're witnessing a large and permanent decline in the demand for types of property that are typically found in town and city centres. Secondly, that as a consequence of that decline, there's a high probability of blight affecting those town and city centres in ways that are likely to impair the economic and social prospects of places. And thirdly, that in order to mitigate or avoid blight, but also to take advantage of what I think are abundant opportunities, there's a need for action that's swift, substantial, and bold. So let me take each of those points in turn. Declining demand for certain types of commercial property is not a new phenomenon. That's particularly true with respect to retail property in high streets. But the current decline, which, as I say, I expect to be permanent and significant, is caused by 3 factors. The first is digital technologies that facilitate and significantly reduce the cost of home shopping and home working. The second, which is come to bear this year are health concerns which push in exactly the same directions as the digital technologies. And thirdly, we have the current recession and what's likely to be a prolonged period of high unemployment, during which time disposable incomes will be depressed, affecting most the demand for services like retail and hospitality that are found on high streets. My second proposition concerns blight. And what I mean by blight is a circumstance in which a sufficient amount of property is vacant for a sufficiently long period of time to cast a pall over an area in ways that reduce the probability of it being attractive to investors, consumers, and others. And that can come about through two related routes. The first is that a characteristic of property markets is that supply can remain fairly fixed for fairly long periods of time. It doesn't respond quickly to changes in the wider economic environment. In the jargon, the supply of property is inelastic. And one of the characteristics of a market with inelastic supply is that it doesn't take much in the way of a shift in demand to cause large changes in prices and values. The second factor here is that, amongst other things, property is an asset class. And in Scotland and the UK, asset owners are a very heterogeneous group. They range on one hand from listed property companies, insurers, and pension funds, each of which works under different forms of regulations that, amongst other things, dictate how values are arrived at and reported. So we have that very formal professional group on the one hand, to, on the other, much less professional, more informal, smaller scale investors, almost hobby investors in some occasions, whose incentives are quite different and behaviours are quite different from the larger scale investors. And a combination of a large fall in values, which we're already seeing at present, combined with different incentives that bear on different types of asset owners, could give rise to a reluctance on the part of many owners to sell their properties, to hold on to them in the hope of price recovery. And that gives rise to the vacancies that could in turn give rise to blight. Now, we've already seen substantial falls in asset values in the course of this year. British Land and Land Securities, two of the largest UK property companies, reported their annual results in the early summer. Their year ends are both on the 31st of March, which means that the valuations that applied at that date took account of only a week's worth of lockdown experience. But both of them wrote down the value of their retail portfolios by more than a quarter. And in the year to date, both of them have seen share price falls in excess of 40%, compared with a fall in wider equity values of around 20%. So this is already with us. What do we do about it? I think there is scope to act and act effectively, but as I said at the outset, I think that has to be swift, substantial, and bold. It should start with clear plans for places, and I think local authorities are well placed to lead on that work. And there's a premium on doing that very quickly indeed. Following that, I think we'll have to give serious thought to more extensive use of compulsory purchase orders. And if we can make these changes sufficiently quickly, we also need to think hard about the potential of compulsory sales orders, land value taxation, and more extensive use of interventions like Fresh Start relief. If we have the plans in place, that might well be sufficient to start to stimulate investor confidence, but the other actions have to follow swiftly in train. So those are my three propositions: that we're facing a permanent decline in demand, that it could cause blight, but that there are things that can be done about it. I'm now happy to hand back to Charlie and then over to the panel, and I'd be happy later to take any of your questions.
Okay, Stephen, thank you very much. Very clear as ever, and gives us a great contextual start to add the different shades of colour from different members of the panel. So, Phil, would you like to kick us off on that?
Yeah, thanks for that, Charlie. And again, I read your paper with interest, Stephen. So undoubtedly some hard times ahead, but also a massive opportunity, I think. You know, the economy wasn't working that well for people before COVID, and I really hope that we don't try to just get back to some sense of pre-COVID in terms of our thinking. I think we do need to be transformative and fairly radical, perhaps a period for big government, both centrally and locally, to stimulate our thinking. But I mean, with climate emergency in the background, we're still allowing spread development of housing, edge of town retail. We need to start just thinking more sensibly about, you know, putting our investments back into the core, basically thinking about climate and sustainability. So the things that I've picked up are traditionally our dominant economic engines, our cities, have stalled, and there appears to be some sort of social, economic, environmental renaissance in our towns. I think if we harness this properly, it could give us some answers to help shape a more attractive and more equitable and sustainable post-COVID Scotland. So the trends are cities are struggling, towns are benefiting, nobody's travelling into the office, students are trickling back into the city, which might help a wee bit, but there's still no tourism or hospitality. There's still that continued drift online and edge of town convenience, albeit at the same time there seems to be a big return to high street retailing. I don't know whether that's just an intervention in time or whether that's something that we can actually make more permanent. The modal shift in the work pattern means that, as Stephen pointed out, the commercial sector really does need to think and rebalance quickly. We'll see a sharp correction in property values, surplus supply. In England, as I said, as a director in the UK task force, along with Emma, who will be speaking later, we've seen the Westminster government come in with permitted development rights. And I think we need to be really careful about that, not to destroy the character of places just by dumping a whole load of residential into what was formerly retail or offices. It needs to be done very, very carefully at a place-based approach, and the quality needs to be there as well. You can't just flip an office into a house overnight. It needs to be done with great care. But the funds and institutions that have already been steadily reducing exposure to retail over the last decade or so, so there's a bit of buffer in all of that. But collectively, I'll go back to my first point, climate is probably a bigger issue than COVID. So we do need to look at this forced intervention of COVID, and some of the things that have happened have given us a real head start in terms of locking better behaviours in. A quick run through what we've been doing in terms of short, medium and long. We had to act very, very quickly in terms of whenever the lockdown occurred, because towns and city centres were probably the most impacted. So we came up with the BIDS Resilience Fund. And we also invoked some legislation as part of the COVID emergency bill to allow bids to extend, really because they had hyper-local knowledge. They were able to connect with communities, support vulnerability, get the necessary PPE and safety into place, and also navigate the complexity of all of the grants and furlough and deferral schemes that the governments were implementing. The second phase of the bids funding is going to come out on Monday, and that's about promoting the safe and tentative recovery, the reopening. To be honest, some businesses have already recovered their early year losses, and some have actually been doing particularly well through the pandemic. Convenience stores in particular have been reporting large increases, and again capturing the modal shift in terms of how people are arriving at the stores 60% plus are arriving on foot or by cycling. So there is definitely something around reduced carbon footprint. In the medium term, we've also implemented the Scotland Loves Local campaign. This is to try and encourage localism, community wealth, food security, resilient local supply chains. So we've taken out prime time television slots with STV and Borders TV. We have a national press campaign on the way with NewsQuest, DC Thompson, the Press and Journal, basically to build on all of the good behaviours, the reconnection with our neighbours, our local green space, the heritage, our local high streets, and the good behaviours of walking and cycling and volunteering, etc. So this message hopefully will lead to a stronger recovery and more resilience in food security and supply chain, and a better understanding that the pound that you spend in your local economy is likely to flip 5 or 6 times, which means we could actually see a quicker recovery as opposed to just buying everything online. So the second phase of that campaign is basically going to advance that even further. So you'll see the local farmer who has a dairy farm and was supplying hospitality, now supplying domestic and local grocers, etc., recruiting another driver who drops it down to the local grocer store, who employs the young person who goes next door to get the haircut, who meets up with his pal in the local coffee shop. The next phase of the TV creative is going to sort of embed all of that. That's the medium-term approach. And there's going to be another fund programme for government. Did say that Scotland Loves Local is gaining a sort of traction to help stimulate recovery in the high street. So we are going to see another fund probably around October time, where we'll be asking small localities to come up with ideas to react to the ever-emerging threats of COVID, but also to look at what sort of investments are needed just to keep the recovery bubbling along. The longer term stuff I think is more interesting. There's currently a national review being undertaken into our towns policy. Our towns policy was already seen as international best practice, but we need to make sure it remains relevant. So chaired by Professor Lee Sparks, supported by the Cabinet Secretary, we have been gathering lots of oral and written evidence over the last 2 or 3 weeks to make sure we've got an action plan and delivery vehicles ready to hit the ground running as soon as possible. So the town's policy is going to link into the National Infrastructure Plan, National Planning Framework, Housing 2040, Climate Emergency, Vacant and Derelict Land Policy, Health and Wellbeing agendas, digital transport, energy, culture, economy, etc. Linked into, I don't know if people picked up the programme for government concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods. So people should be able to work, live, play within a 20-minute journey distance. And again, I think that's as relevant to towns as it is to cities. And within the programme for government, there was a doubling up of investment. So over the next 5 years, we're going to see £270 million made available to this type of repurposing recovery, and a further 500 million for the active travel agenda. So I think there's lots of opportunity to come. We need to be more aggressive around linking this to place plans. You know, we're still building a load of boxes in the middle of the farmer's field for people to live in and to travel long distances. Why can't we build out the core and recover a lot of the fallow built environment that already exists within our town and city centres? Glasgow, for example, is the least densely populated city in Europe in its category. You know, nobody lives in the city centre of Glasgow. You have to go to Shawlands or Postle before you actually find people who live. All of that space is lying dormant, and we need to recover that, and that would bring vitality back into the place as well as being more sustainable and climate friendly. So more aggression around the town centre. First principle about repopulating, about putting public services back into the centre. To be honest, all of this is quite straightforward. We just need to be more aggressive around it and trying to force that into local plans and how people are thinking about their place. But I suppose as a segue, prior to COVID, we'd already been looking at how to engage with the commercial sector, and particularly what do we do with the big shopping centres that were starting to creak. You know, the covenant was weakening. So we had a couple of round tables with Scottish Government, Cabinet Secretary, the commercial sector. So how could Scottish Government, local government help stimulate that? And then came along a bug. But that's probably a good way just to segue across to our next speaker, because there's a relevance in terms of the commercial sector. That's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Doing my job for me there is to tease up Emma very nicely to follow up on that. Emma, over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for having me on this morning to speak to you all. For those who don't know me, my name's Emma Mackenzie, and I'm a Director and Head of Asset Management at NewRiver. Now, NewRiver are a real estate investment trust, so we're a listed business and we trade on the stock market. And we are investors, owners, developers, managers of retail and leisure assets throughout the United Kingdom. So we have 33 shopping centres in towns throughout the country. 4 of those are in Scotland. Four of those are in Scotland. And we have 25 retail parks, 4 of which are also in Scotland. So we have 8 assets in Scotland out of our portfolio. And we also have over 700 pubs, 100 of which are in Scotland. So we're very much at home in Scotland. I'm obviously Scottish, but we are exposed to and have knowledge and experience of what's happening throughout the United Kingdom in Northern Ireland, Scotland, England and Wales. And what we're seeing across the country at the moment in retail and leisure is very much an acceleration of what was happening anyway. And as Stephen very eloquently described in his piece this morning, the reasons for that are an oversupply of retail space. And that's not something that's happened latterly and recently. It's been happening for over 20 years. And if I was doing a presentation, I could bore you with graphs showing that the vacancy rate has tracked upwards for the last 20 years and more. And also, while at the same time the vacancy rate is tracking upwards, we're also still continuing to build space. So the actual retail space at the same time is still increasing. And a lot of that space was out of town space in the last 20 years. It's been built on the peripheries of towns. And if alongside that, the increasing space, the increase in vacancy rate, if you looked at the way that rental values have tracked along in the last 20 years, they've sort of, in the retail sectors, have bumped along the bottom just with slight inclines and declines along with the market. Supermarket rents are the only sector in retail that's been different to that, which has consistently risen. So the combination of those factors has been in the background, and what's accelerated it is the last 6 months of COVID, and that's also not going to go away. But what that's meant for businesses like ours that are, we're a real estate investment trust, we have to deliver returns to our investors and shareholders. So we have to drive performance from the assets that we buy. And that is becoming increasingly challenging because of the oversupply and the demand and the change in the retail market. And NewRiver is at the better end, certainly at the moment, of the retail market, because we've bought assets that are town centre. And we've strategically never bought anything that has a department store. We have a very limited exposure to mid-market fashion. And that's all the brands that you'd see in bigger shopping centres in the Silverburns of this world, where there's Hobbs and Jigsaws and All Saints and all the Arcadia brands, the Topshops, Dorothy Perkins, etc. And a lot of the carnage that we've seen before and during, and particularly forward-looking, is in that mid-market fashion area, and we have very limited exposure to that. We also have very limited exposure to casual dining, which again, there's going to be a lot of damage and has been in that sector. And our assets, really, because of their location in town centres and not peripheral, they have underlying alternative use value. And that's what's going to support our thought process and strategy going forward. And it's not new to us. We've done a lot of that already, because a lot of space in the last 20 years in retail there's been too much of it. So we've already repositioned space and done medical centres and libraries and gyms, and we've knocked down some space and merged some space, etc. But certainly what we're going to have to do more of and more quickly is exactly that, the repurposing of retail space. Because what's challenging just now for the private sector to invest in towns throughout Scotland and beyond is that the values underpinning them are putting pressure on us to be able to actually drive returns from that. And what we're seeing is that if we were to invest in towns like this, it would be almost impossible for us to do an equity capital raise, and also to get bank funding to do any sort of private sector investment in retail throughout the United Kingdom just now is a very, very slim chance of being able to do that. And what we'd like to do is to continue to invest and to continue to drive returns from them. And there is, in every situation where there is a crisis, there is an opportunity. And that certainly, to be able to do that, you have to be able to price risk and understand the risks that you're looking at. And if you are sector specialists and know the underlying performance and get to know the retailers' performance and the businesses that are invested in your business, and certainly we are very much aware that we have to know the underlying performance of the retailers who are our occupiers and our partners, because without the businesses being, as those retail businesses and leisure businesses, etc., being a success, our business will not be a success. So the sustainability of all businesses and all other uses in a town are completely fundamentally interlinked. And that's very much where the public sector come into play, because the public sector and the councils have the very privileged position of having that leadership piece and be able to harness and collaborate and bring together what will make a fundamental difference in a town and understand all the factors that will make a place a decent and welcoming place to live. And that's education and infrastructure and jobs and open space and private investment. So working with the public sector is certainly the way forward that we certainly see going forward in curating town centres, because a lot of the retail space, will vary from town to town, will require to be repurposed, and that is where the opportunity is, because there's definitely a lack of retail demand, but there is an awful lot of demand from alternative uses for many towns, and we're seeing a growth in all of those sort of areas, whether that's student accommodation in the private rented sector and leisure uses and gyms and health and well-being opportunities that will continue to flourish, because certainly if there has been any sort of positive that's come out of a global pandemic, I think it's definitely the recognition that all of us have a sense of responsibility to our local communities and towns and the peoples that are in those towns doing all sorts of jobs that we all rely on. And I think people's appreciation of that and loyalty to their own towns has definitely increased. And with people now beginning to work at home more, which is not a trend that's going to go away, there will be opportunities in towns for flexible working space that people can spend a morning in or a couple of hours or have a meeting in, etc. And those places will become more and more local. So from our perspective, without a shadow of a doubt, the last 6 months have been particularly challenging. But we've got real optimism for the future, because I think what it's done is accelerated what was happening anyway. And if people can respond to that and work collaboratively to get a way forward from this, then that surely has to be the legacy of COVID, if it is actually generated a positive way forward to allow people to spend more time in their homes and with their families and in their local communities and feel accountable to that and enjoy being part of something that has a fundamental difference. Because without, there's plenty of evidence to show that if people are happier and their work and life balance is stronger, then everything generates more positive reaction. And being in a place that in a town that is a positive place to live can only benefit everybody going forward, and it has to be viable. There has to be returns in it for businesses like ours to continue to invest, which is very, very much what we want to do. There has to be a return, a financial return in it, and a viability. The same as an independent retailer, they have to be making money to want to still be there, but it's all so interlinked. And certainly as a business, we're very much engaged with councils up and down the country where we own assets to try and really work collaboratively and co-invest and understand how both of us can drive a sustainable future from where we are at the moment. Thank you. That's from me, Charlie. Happy to take questions and at the end of the session as well.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, we'll have a chance for some discussion at the end there, emphasising the importance of collaboration and the role of infrastructure, and that tees up nicely our next contributor from the panel, Neil. Over to you from the Scottish Futures Trust.
Hi, Charlotte. Good morning, everybody. I know a lot of you know me. I'm Neil Rutherford. I lead our economic investment and place team and housing teams at SFT. Diarmaid Lawlor, who's our day-to-day place lead, and Peter Kearns, who leads our asset strategy work, are out there as well. So at some point, depending on questions and other things, we may get them to appear. Really what I want to talk about is maybe more a response to some of these things. I will talk about some of the trends, some of the thoughts, some of the things that are happening, and maybe leave with some areas for consideration or question, because but by my own admission, I don't know everything. I don't have all the answers, and I think it comes back to the point that Emma just made about how we work together. But maybe as people have touched on, And even if you just go back a few days to the programme for government, you can see some big trends or some big areas of focus that are coming. The importance of place-based approaches and place-based programmes are a key part of that. We're seeing more talk about distributed models of delivering services, and particularly for the public sector, so working more locally. And as Phil says, for some that's an opportunity, for others there is a challenge, which again can be turned into an opportunity. The importance of town centres, 20-minute neighbourhoods, the role of housing changing, so very much around the importance of digital connectivity, green spaces, and then actually how we build our houses in terms of modern methods, off-site construction, all these kinds of things. There's also the opportunity how we drive benefit from how we spend an awful lot of money through all of that. So coming very much back into that community wealth building space, community benefits, local supply chains, local employment, local skills. The green element is obviously just all pervading through the kinds of things we're doing. And I guess for me, sitting in the economic investment space is how, yes, that's good and we can all drive off that, but sometimes there's a question about what does it all mean and how do we respond to it and what kinds of things are we going to do. And then maybe very importantly, Scotland has a series of strong clusters around the country. So how do we build off those? How do we benefit? How do we get them to work collaboratively? And again, a few days ago, there was the Logan Review, and again, the Programme for Government talks about this, effectively tech hubs. So how do we grow those? There's 5 of them are going to be coming out over the next few years to drive that sector and building some of the skills that we have. So I mean, just in terms of partly ongoing work, partly response, I mean, infrastructure is a key part of our towns, cities, country. It is there to serve, it's not a means in itself. So how does infrastructure support and enable some of the activity that we have? And infrastructure can be quite wide in terms of its definition, and it's only growing in terms of where we are. So I'm going to talk more about our place, asset strategy, economic investment, and housing work. But we do have teams who sit in digital, low carbon, construction, education, which again is all relevant. So we as an organisation work very closely together. We also work very closely with others to make sure that there's collaboration and coordination around that. So Diarmaid's out there, he leads our place activity. I think reflecting on some of the points made today, place plans, place programmes, that's really all key. I think there's an element of some of those plans already exist. I think in the chat function there was a question. Some of those will need to be revisited. Others are probably still relevant. So I guess through all the world at the moment, there's a bit about intentional decisions. We have to sometimes quickly make decisions, but they need to be informed and intentional rather than going with the flow and just accepting what's there. Around asset strategy, very much that repurposing, recycling, reusing existing spaces and what the art of the possible is. A key part for us there is about rural hubs. So we have a work strand that's looking at that, about how do we create some of these spaces in rural areas. Around housing, the focus, we have a number of traditional approaches there, primarily mid-market rental type approaches, but increasingly we've been looking at that public sector-led deliveries. So there was a paper recently about councils potentially building for sale or for market rent. I think that there's still some thought about where that would work, but very much, stepping in and potentially filling market failures or gaps there. Town centre living is a big part of that. Funding and financing around lease-based structures. So how do we use some of those kinds of things to do there? Around the economic investment space, increasingly I find my day, it's embedded support or working with others around strategic sites or strategic priorities, major developments, whatever you want to call them. And I'm going to come back to that concept in a minute. But also some of the funding and financing tools we have, how do we use those to the best effect? So that was a little bit of a canter through about some of the areas we're looking at, almost as a direct, well, they were part of our thinking before. Some of that becomes even more important. For me, some of the areas that I guess I spend some time thinking about, that national, regional, local coordination, how do we just get better at thinking how they fit together and how they might drive opportunities and collaboration and coordination? I talked about the intentional decisions. I think fit for tools, we have a series of approaches at the moment. Some of them are very transferable, others won't be. So it comes back to the point that Stephen made earlier on. You know, what additional powers, tools, structures, partnerships do we need to do that? There are different ones that will have to happen to make some of that effectively deliver success. With somebody, Emma talked about leverage. I guess that maybe my final thought, and given my role, we are here to work with others. So if there's anything that I've spoken about today, please come and discuss. But I guess that one of the overriding elements for me about all of this is resource. Where are we going to find all the people to do this? And I think for me, that comes back to rethinking how we work collectively, how we drive that collaboration, and how we just get better potentially at sharing resources. That's very much one for discussion and to come back to, because again, there isn't an answer. So I'm going to stop there. I've probably gone over my allotted time, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. That's great, and obviously a really important role in pulling together that partnership and collaboration that's been talked about a lot here. Last but very much not least, Shona, land is at the heart. Management and ownership and use of land is at the heart of all this. So your contribution is going to be really welcome. Shona, over to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, checking I'm unmuted there. So, yeah, thanks very much. So, I guess anybody who's spent any more than about 2 minutes with me over the past couple of years is going to know that the Land Commission has been doing a lot of work on vacant and derelict land over the last couple of years. I think I've bored everybody rigid about talking about this. It's taken over my entire life, it feels like sometimes. I think this is really relevant to the discussion. You're all probably really familiar with the stats. Scotland's got about 11,000 hectares of vacant and derelict land spread across about 3,500 sites, covers an area about twice the size of Dundee, and actually that's just the officially designated vacant and derelict land. That doesn't even include most of the smaller sites that blight our town city centres, so the kind of stuff that I know Phil gets excited about. So we really do have a problem with this. Back at the end of 2018, the Land Commission set up a task force to try and address this. And we didn't set out to fix vacant and derelict land. We're not big enough to do that. And we set out to do something that I actually think is even more ambitious, and actually in the current climate, I think probably even more important. We want to make it easier to bring sites back into use. We set out to transform Scotland's approach to vacant and derelict land, and to make it easier to tackle that legacy. But we also want to shape the policy environment to provide make it easier to stop a new legacy from emerging in the future. So I think at the time there were people who were quite frustrated by that approach. You know, it's a bit slower, it doesn't sound as exciting, you know, and everybody likes a big shiny project. But actually, given what's happening just now with COVID and all that's been said so far today about the risk of creating a new legacy of urban dereliction, I'm really glad that we took the approach that we did. Because you really don't need to spend very long looking at the current vacant and derelict land register to realise that actually a lot of what's on there already, and the really persistent sites, some of the ones that have been, some of them have been around for as long as I've been alive, you know, and a lot of that is due to a result of a poor public policy response, you know, previous bad decision making on the part of the public sector in response to previous structural economic changes. So the task force is going to be making its final recommendations on or around the 1st of October. So a wee plug there, please do look out for those. But I think if we can implement even half of what's in there, we'll stand a pretty good chance of avoiding the creation of a new legacy. There's loads in the report, there's lots and lots in there, but I've only got 5 minutes. I think probably we've already gone over our allotted time. So I'm going to focus on one area in particular that I hope is going to be particularly relevant to this audience. And that's around about this piece about how the public sector makes decisions about what to spend money on. I think Neil talked about intentional decision making. I like that phrase because I think that's going to become really, really important as we go forward. Because at the moment, decisions about which sites get developed and when, and about which sites get sold and when, often tend to be made on the basis of quite a narrow cost benefit analysis. And it's often sort of financial returns to the landowner are the most important thing, usually, if not always. And when the numbers stack up, nothing happens. And that's okay if you're a profit-driven firm, but it's not okay if you're the public sector. The public sector has been pretty good in the past. Unless a site is part of a wider regeneration initiative, then wider wellbeing benefits are often not really part of the equation. And where sites are part of a programme of disposals to fund core activity, then financial considerations often trump everything else. And if it's cheaper to meet departmental obligations, if those departmental obligations aren't around regeneration, and if it's cheaper to do that by building on greenfield sites, then that's often what happens. And you can see that in relation to public expenditure and everything from housing to hospitals. And I do think that that's a big part of the reason why we have such a legacy of vacant and derelict land at the moment. So if we want to make sure that doesn't happen again, we do need to change the basis for decision making. So that's why one of the things that the task force is going to be recommending is that we need a new approach to project appraisal in which well-being is prioritised over financial returns. And what that means is it means we need a whole new way of appraising public investment that takes account of the full benefits of bringing sites back into use, not just the financial benefits, and also looks at the opportunity cost of continued inaction. And we need to make sure that framework is being used right across the public sector, local, national level, and right across all areas of expenditure. So I know that's much easier to say than to do. So we went ahead and we just did it. We worked with a team of very clever people from Bigger Economics. And I have to say that because I think Graham Blackett from Bigger Economics is on the call. So I have to say they're very clever, but they are actually very clever. And they helped us come up with a new way of doing things, a better way of doing things. We published a paper setting out why things need to change earlier this year. And we're using that at the moment to try and convince people in government and across the public sector about why the approach needs to change. But we went further than that, and we also published guidance setting out in very practical terms, actually, how this could be done. So now we're talking to people right across loads of public bodies to try and convince them to start using the guidance. So I guess, all of this is a bit of a plug really for that work. And all of that work's available on our website. I actually included a really good video, I think, of a couple of my colleagues talking to Graham Blackett from Bigger Economics, describing what we did. So please do have a look. And I really think it's a great bit of work and potentially something that can really change how we make decisions. So if you like what you see and you're thinking of using it, then please do come and talk to us. And please look out for the recommendations in the task force when they're published in a few weeks' time. And that's all I had.
Great, thank you very much, Shona. Thank you to all the panel. I mean, within a very short period of time, you packed an awful lot in. So let's open it up for discussion. As I said, if you can use the raise hand function, the participants box, if you want to ask something sort of directly. I've also got a number of things that are coming in through the chat box. I mean, one question that's sort of quite an interesting general one that maybe kick us off about, it's about sort of reimagining the communities that we're talking about. Elaine Morrison's talking about, there are a number of communities that are known quite well, but there are a number of emerging. To what extent should we focus on these known communities, or should we widen it up to some of the newer communities that are developing? I hope I've managed to get across the point of your question there, Elaine. So, anybody like to kick this off from the panel?
Charlie, on that one, could I maybe bring in Diarmaid? Because I think from his place perspective, he would probably have some good insights to that. Diarmaid, if you're out there. There he is.
Yep, I'm here.
Just want to question, Charlie, just only useful.
Yeah, it's new communities that are developing that could be built on.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, I suppose a couple of ways of looking at that. Just in terms of residential communities, there's been some really interesting work done by Housing Lane, actually. So they've brought together a series of case studies around how care and town centres start to work. And the interesting thing about that is about stretching investment in one sector to provide benefits for the other sectors, and make use of the adaptability of some of the town centre infrastructures. So I think there's something around leverage. So that's a first bit. Another bit, and just looking at the chat there as well, Charlie, around rural hubs, and there was a discussion about what's the demand for rural hubs and what would people want in those services. So we're currently talking with public sector partners around the distributed models, and the programme for government talks about distributed hubs and distributed models. So there's the redeployment of services. So that's one side. The second side then is around supporting communities to sustain services. So there's kind of models of sustainability. I think the third bit then is around enterprise. So building enterprise opportunities and communities in it. So two things then on the community bit: leverage of investment, and then the second one is about portfolios coming together in town centres.
Okay, great. Any other members of the panel want to comment on that? Couple of people.
Charlie,
yeah.
Can I come in on that very briefly?
Sure.
I suppose there are ways of posing a question like that, and my answer would be that the collective we shouldn't be focusing on communities of the type that Elaine mentions. I think these are distinctly very local challenges, albeit that they'll play out across the country as a whole, so that the responses to them and the identification of what the appropriate communities are, I think, should be done best at the most local level possible, which is probably the local authority.
Yeah, actually that ties in, thanks Stephen, that ties in with the point that Brian's made, and I think a couple of other people on the panel made, about the sort of the growing community wealth building agenda as well, and what are the opportunities for linking that agenda with the place building agenda as we try and sort of reimagine this sort of new future. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Charlie, I'm happy to start on that. I mean, I think the principles of community wealth building are sensible. When you look at the amount of money that the public sector spends, so how do we leverage, using Diarmaid's word, leverage more of that to create opportunities for our own communities, our own supply chains, how we improve where people live. Some of that thinking, I guess over the years, there has been, it's always an interesting one. There is current thinking through community benefits and other things. It's obviously, it's a wider element there, but I think what may be interesting is when we put conditionality around public sector funding. So to get my money, you are going to have to do these kinds of things. There's a balance in there. There's probably an evolution as well, in that it will grow, it will change over time, rather than maybe having this is it from day one, and if you don't give it to me, then you're not getting my money. So I think that conditionality of funding is a key part to delivering a lot of that.
Emma, any thoughts from your perspective? Particularly, you were talking about the importance of collaboration and public sector leadership in this.
Yes, I think we've got quite a way to go in terms of trusting the two sectors. There's and that really has to be built on a very much kind of an open book and approach, and an understanding of the drivers of both businesses, and certainly understanding what the needs of our business are and what the needs of a council are the kind of starting points, and trying to find solutions and building strong relationships that hopefully understand the different drivers of those two businesses, so that can deliver the common objective. And I think that there's a much greater openness for that than we've ever seen, because of the understanding, as has been touched on before, about resources, and the public sector and the resources they have both financially and on human resources, in terms of the expertise, and certainly NewRiver, we're experts in retail and leisure, etc., but we're not experts in a lot of residential and a lot of alternative uses, and we're working with other partners in all these areas to try and deliver a change in our own existing portfolio in towns. So working with people who have the knowledge and the access to funding, to try and bring that to the party, I think will actually allow change to actually happen. But a lot of it is, it starts with the building of those relationships and trusting those relationships and understanding the drivers of both parties to try and affect change.
So this is a relationship thing as much as it is a structural thing in many cases. Then,
just to build on that, Charlie, on the relationship bit, I think that there's a lot of resource from the experience of COVID that should be mobilized. So the way that the response happened so quickly was on the back of nourished relationships at community level in particular areas. So that idea of nourished, so that's about falling out and making up. That's about kind of small things aggregated. So I think that one thing is around that. The second thing is that has delivered a stress testing of local capability, who stepped up, who didn't step up, who's able to do what. And I think the third thing then, in terms of structural relationships, that allows us to be more intentional about effective co-production. So not just the rhetoric of it, but how actually would you mobilize that local capacity and the institutional capacity around new focus areas. So I think there's a lot still to be leveraged from the COVID learning.
Okay, good. I see I've got a couple of hands raised in the participants box. So I'm going to ask Ian Ross first, and then Chris Cook to put their questions, and we'll take them, the two of them together and see how the panel want to respond. Ian.
Hello everybody, how are you? Sorry, for those that don't know me, my name's Ian Ross. I work in the Economic Development team at South Lanarkshire Council, and I have been very interested with the discussion this morning. An awful lot of very interesting points. And I think, I suppose just start with to reassure everybody, a lot of what's been described, certainly in the way we approach our work, it's what we do. I'm very taken with Emma's comments around that public-private partnership working in South Lanarkshire. We have some very big asset holders around town centres and other kind of assets, and simplifying things very quickly in those discussions. We always point out, we know you're a commercial organisation, we know you're in this to make money. That's fine. We'd have no problem with that. We need to understand that. We need to work. If we're going to work with you, we need to recognise that. That's all good. I think sitting here as again, paraphrasing, the guy that needs to deliver all of this within my local area, there's an awful lot of challenges, both short and medium and long term, in terms of all this reimagining, looking forward. That's absolutely vital, and we've started a lot of that work with a lot of our town centres and how that might be, and whether that's through the town centre boost funding and providing social rented housing accommodation on former derelict sites. We work with, we're fortunate to benefit from some vacant derelict land fund money, and we're looking at how we can lever that in. But there's a bit before that we are under pressure for, and our business support team is working with businesses on a daily basis, and they're not interested in reimagining. They're interested in this week, next week, getting beyond Christmas and that kind of thing. And I suppose it's just around that whole balance. But I think one of the comments in the box, I think it was Joanne, was talking about financial models and financial viability. And yes, the public sector, our part of the public sector, we have a massive role to play. It's an economic development forum. We're an economic development team. We need to deliver on all these ambitions, but there's only so much that we can do, and by that, there was some suggestion about we could redivert or look at how we do things differently. Very often, certainly in terms of the financial models where we are, the land values, the money available to us, we're struggling to get a viable project at all. So it's not necessarily prioritising so that there's profit or whatever. It's just literally, how can we get this project over the line, working with the public sector money available, working with private sector colleagues, working with third sector, the community, that whole gambit. How do we get these over the line? So I think, and I think that if that sounds negative, it's not meant to, but it's really just sort of saying we recognise that all that it's in the mix. We do an awful lot of what's been described, and it's about how we continue to evolve and make that better, whilst prioritising all the different aspects that people have focused on this morning.
Great, thank you. And yeah, it's great to get that perspective on the challenges faced on the ground there, particularly this challenge between dealing with coping with the short-term crisis and trying to build whatever the new economy might look like. I'll ask the panel to comment in a minute, but Chris, do you want to put your question or comment there first, Chris Cook?
Yes, thanks very much, Charlie. My background, quickly, I'm a senior research fellow at UCL, the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security, and I was asked by Lord Reid a dozen years ago, after the financial crash, to basically think the unthinkable and look at complementary means of investment. And, you know, moving on maybe from conventional debt rent models to something else. And that's what I've been doing and conducting action research in Scotland and internationally on this. And what I'm interested in is institutions in terms of agreements, not so much organizations. We have enough organizations as it is, and instruments, you know, the way in which we actually invest, you know, risk sharing, production sharing, surplus sharing agreements, for instance, which have been around a long time. And these are complementary. So we don't need changes in the law to actually do these things. We can actually implement them or start implementing them tomorrow. As an example, just give you one, I'm working on one in Linlithgow, where I live, with Scottish Investment, well, it's the Building Scotland Fund people there, basically, and this will interest Shona, I think, saying, well, don't sell the land, put the land into the pot, put it into, we'll be using an LLP and then something else. So put the land into the pot, we don't value it, we don't price it, put it in, and we'll agree a proportional share of the outcome. And we set a target rate of return, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's just a completely different way of looking at it. And if it works, because this is market failure, it's probably going to be valid across 10,000 acres or whatever the hell it is. So this is a sort of practical prototyping I'm interested in. Anybody here who's interested in this sort of, you know, proof of concept stuff, get in touch. Thanks.
Right. Thanks. Right, okay, look, we're approaching 11 o'clock now. I said I might let it run on a bit, but I think what I'll do is I'll now invite the sort of panel to comment on those points, but also any general sort of last points they might like to make. And in particular, maybe there's another point that's been raised here on the chat about, you know, what might success look like? So in sort of a 5-10 years time, if the sorts of things we've been talking about here do work, yeah, what that might look like. So I'm going to do it in sort of reverse order, and Shona, I'll ask you for any sort of last comments reflecting on what you've heard or seen in the chat box and the like, just to begin to round things up.
Yeah. I mean, where to start? There's so much I can say.
Not quite.
The first thing on the what does success look like, and the short answer is yes. We've got loads of examples, and I've just stuck a link to some of them in the chat box there. And I think my personal favourite is the one in, I think it's North Lanarkshire, the Wishaw pump track, which to everybody else under the age of about 20 is a BMX track, I think, and it's just fantastic. On this idea of risk share, and I think that's a really interesting one, and I was really interested to hear what Chris was saying. Land Commission did a bit of work on this a couple of years ago, and Neil was involved in this as well. He'll know what I'm talking about. So the Scottish Futures Trust, looking at what was called land value capture. And this all comes from this. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about how the public sector could capture more of the uplift of development. You know, when land values go up as a result of development, how can the public sector capture more of that value? And I actually think that the whole discussion is wrong. And we shouldn't be talking about how we capture value. We should be talking about how we share the value, because if we start talking about how we share the value, then, you know, we stop putting off the private sector. You know, it shouldn't be a sort of winner takes all situation. The role of the public sector shouldn't just be about fixing market failure. It should be actually about creating value. So I know we're going over time, so I'll leave it there.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Neil, last comments from you.
I think, can everyone hear me? Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess just picking up on Ian's points, and it's easy for me to say, but I think there's an element of prioritization around this, development of appropriate tools. I do think the resource element, as he touched on, is a huge part of this, about how do we just create more capability to deliver things, which might actually mean that we focus on less. to then hopefully deliver more in a better way. And the other bit I'm going to pick up on is maybe a little bit of the last one about structures and infrastructure funding in general, which Stefano's mentioned in the side panel. I agree, and it comes back to the point that Shona makes. How we look at some of these things we need to think about, but I guess ultimately there's almost a range of interventions and levers that I have. Some of them are around coordination and bringing people together, all the way through policy, regulation, planning, and ultimately structures. But ultimately, there may be things that I just have to pay for if I really, really think they're important. And for me, how I get to the bits of how I use the funding that I have as almost secondary to all those other things. And indeed, if the private sector or third sector can just get on and do stuff, just do it. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. Emma, that's a good segue into you there, I think. Oh, you're on mute.
So yes, I'm an optimist. So I very much hope that there's a bright future for us all ahead. But certainly one other final point I thought is worth making is what the public sector definitely have in their basket is their covenant strength, and that can be a great source of potential funding if property is a physical asset, and the ownership of that and supporting occupiers in it is something that is valuable. It's a valuable asset to have, and covenant strength from the public sector is certainly worth a consideration in terms of generating an income stream to affect regeneration in towns. So from our perspective, I look forward with optimism. There is demand for space from a variety of sectors for many towns and cities. And working collaboratively will tease out that demand, and from demand becomes opportunity and fulfillment of that. But I completely appreciate that it's a very challenging set of circumstances for the public sector to try and address holistically, and from the private sector. So leaning on one another and looking forward, hopefully we'll all go over the line at the end of it.
Great, absolutely, good. Phil, we're leaning on you.
Yeah, okay. I think it's important, Ian's point, we're put it in context, we're trying to undo 60 years of decline within our town centres. So it's not going to happen overnight. There's always going to be a tension between the here and now, the salvage job and the longer term plans. So I wouldn't get too caught up in that. There is a mix of short, medium and long term things happening. But I'll just use a good example, and it's one Dermot's familiar with. Ardrossan, I remember getting a phone call from the leader of North Ayrshire Council jumping up and down saying, we've won the ferry contract, Troon weren't successful with their bid. Ardrossan saved, and I sort of said, really? What's the long-term vision for Ardrossan? So we all went down and had a chat, and very quickly everybody threw an honest, on the table, disinvestments, new investments, what's going to happen. It's always 100 million quid, so there's a new community centre, super secondary school, the bigger harbour. And if they didn't change their outlook, 1 million people would have been jumping across to Arran and doing the reverse journey. Nobody was stopping off in Ardrossan. So we repurposed a vision. We shown them what the town could become if they looked at community wealth and engaged local supply chain. That public investment would encourage private investment. There would be more collaboration. There'd be more employment. There would be an economic purpose to the place, but nothing happened. Again, there's something about risk aversion within the public sector. This is the way we've always done it. So there has to be some sort of radical changes. Maybe some of the stuff Chris alluded to in terms of new models. We've got the National Investment Bank looking for this type of regenerative project. Again, it requires private and social partnership in all of that. Emma said about covenant, yes, that's important, but there's something about procurement and risk and culture within the public sector that needs to be addressed very quickly if we're going to move forward at a pace. That's my final contribution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Phil. And Stephen, last word to you.
Thank you, Charlie. If I can just focus on the successes question that you posed. From my own perspective, there are notable successes. I think on the very large scale, St James Centre in Edinburgh, for which our colleagues at SFT can take great credit. In Glasgow, there's the work of Clyde Gateway, and I think what Clyde Gateway does is to emphasise the point Shona made, that many of these challenges have been with us for a very long time, and it takes considerable resource often to put them right. In terms of what success for me would look like in the future, If we were having this discussion in 10 years' time, I would hope that, speaking as a Glasgow nationalist, we would have the upper part of St Vincent Street fully residential, and the High Street goods yard, which I went to school beside 45 years ago and is still vacant, would have some kind of activity on it.
Yeah. Well, there we go. That's a good, very visible, for us Glasgow residents, that would be a very visible measure of success. Can I just say thank you very much to all of the panel. Thank you very much to everybody that's participated in being on this call. There's been a lot of activity on the chat function as well. Apologies if I haven't been able to capture everything in the time available. We're planning another couple of these conversations in October, looking at something around the impact of the end of the furlough scheme on the labour market. And then in November, looking at the role of innovation in recovery. Those are our ideas at the moment. I should also mention, I'll get in terrible trouble if I don't, we have a couple of places left on upcoming CPD courses. One next week on appraisal and evaluation, and one the week after on inclusive growth. So if you're interested in that, check them out on the website. But after that, we commercial, and nothing more from me to say other than thank you again to the panel. Thank you again for participating, and have a very good weekend.